What do you call a tractor when the paint is gone, the seat is split, and the tracks are sunk halfway into the mud? Most people at Bell County Farm Auction called it dead. Harold Pike called it a locked door, and he paid $37 for the key. The auctioneer did not even climb onto the trailer. He stood in front of Lot 4, 1, 2, tapped the rusted crawler with the back of his clipboard and said, "We are not selling a tractor here. We are selling scrap iron with a steering wheel." The crowd laughed because it looked true. The machine was a small orchard crawler, the kind built low and narrow so it could creep between fruit trees without tearing the branches down. Its paint had faded to the color of old mustard. One track was packed with clay. The seat cushion had split open. Rainwater had sat in the toolbox long enough to turn the wrenches orange. Mason Drew, who had owned the neighboring orchard for 30 years, leaned toward Harold's granddaughter and said, "Ellie, don't let him do it. That crawler hasn't breathed since your grandmother was alive." Harold heard him. He did not look offended. He just crouched beside the machine, put 2 fingers on the exposed flywheel, and nudged it. It moved. Only an inch, but it moved. Then Harold stood up and raised his hand. The auctioneer blinked. $37? Harold nodded. The auctioneer grinned into the microphone. "Sold to the only man here optimistic enough to buy a funeral." That line got the biggest laugh of the morning. Ellie filmed it because she thought her grandfather had finally bought something even he could not save. That night, she posted a short clip with one sentence on the screen. "Grandpa bought the dead crawler for $37. By breakfast, it had crossed 500,000 views. By the second evening, a restoration broker named Ruth Keller called Ellie and said, "Tell your grandfather not to let anyone haul that crawler away. If the block is not cracked and the final drives are intact, that machine is worth more than the pickup that dragged it home." Ellie asked Harold if he had heard that. Harold was in the shed with a lantern, wiping mud off the cereal plate with a rag. He said, "I heard it before she did." That was the thing nobody at the auction understood. Harold did not buy the crawler because he was sentimental. He bought it because he had listened to it without it ever starting. The engine had rocked freely by hand. A seized engine does not rock. The magneto still clicked when the flywheel passed the right place. Dead ignition does not click. The fuel bowl smelled like varnish instead of water. That meant old gas, not a flooded crankcase. The track pins were worn, but not hooked sharp. The machine had been parked. It had not been destroyed. Rust was the loudest evidence, but it was not the most important evidence. Harold had learned that lesson at 13, when his father made him rebuild a mower engine on a feed sack behind the dairy barn. His father would point at broken parts and say, "A machine tells the truth. Men just talk over it." 70 years later, the auction yard was still talking over the machine. Harold was not. On Monday morning, Ellie came to the shed expecting to see regret. Instead, She found parts laid out on cardboard in perfect rows. Carburetor, magneto cap, fuel line, sediment bowl, 2 cracked belts, a mouse nest the size of a softball. Harold had written 3 words on a piece of tape stuck to the hood. Not dead, locked. On day 3, he cleaned the fuel system. On day 5, he reset the magneto points. On day 8, he pulled the valve cover and found 2 valves stuck open with old gum and dust. That was the first bad sign. Mason came by that afternoon and stood in the doorway of the shed with his hands in his pockets. He looked at the open engine and said, "There it is. That's where the $37 went." Harold did not answer right away. He soaked the valve stems, tapped each one lightly with a brass drift, and waited. Then he said, "If a door sticks, you don't burn the house down." Mason laughed and drove off. But Ellie did not laugh that time, because she saw Harold mark the valves with a pencil. She saw him rotate the engine a little, stop, listen, rotate it again. He was not guessing. He was reading. The video series grew because viewers could feel that difference. It was not a miracle story. It was a patience story. Every part Harold touched became a clue. Every clue changed the diagnosis. A cracked block would have ended it. A broken final drive would have made it too expensive. A missing magneto would have turned a cheap machine into a parts hunt. But the crawler kept giving Harold just enough truth to keep going. On day 12, Ruth Keller arrived in person. She had driven 6 hours with a camera, a flashlight, and a folder of auction records. She walked around the crawler twice, then looked at Harold and said, "This is a narrow-gauge orchard model. Most of them were worked to death, scrapped, or cut up for parts. Running, with original tracks and a clean serial plate, I would insure it at $18,400. Ellie's mouth opened. Harold only nodded. Ruth said, "You understand I can bring you a buyer before the week is out." Harold wiped his hands on a towel. "Ma'am," he said, "I haven't heard it run yet." By day 15, the shed had become a little theater. Ellie filmed from beside the workbench. Mason watched from outside the door, pretending he had only stopped by for fence wire. 2 teenagers from down the road stood by the apple crates. Ruth stayed quiet at the back, with her folder against her chest. Harold poured clean fuel into the tank. He checked the oil cup. He set the choke. Then he wrapped his hand around the crank. The first pull gave nothing. The second gave a cough. The third gave a sound that made everybody step back. The crawler did not roar. It cleared its throat. A hard metallic cough jumped out of the exhaust, then another, then a rough, uneven chug that shook loose dust from the hood. Ellie forgot she was filming and whispered, "Grandpa." Harold kept one hand near the throttle and listened. Not smiling yet, not celebrating yet. A man who knows machines does not cheer at the first noise. He waits for the rhythm. 10 seconds. 15. 20. The chug steadied. The little crawler sat there on its packed clay tracks, smoking, trembling, and alive. That clip reached 6 million views in 4 days. The title people gave it online was simple. He started the tractor everyone called dead. But Harold corrected Ellie when she read it to him. It wasn't dead, he said. It was locked. 2 weeks later, Ruth brought the first real offer. $18,400, just as promised. Harold thanked her and refused. The buyer raised it to $21,000. Harold refused again. Mason stopped teasing after that. The first time Harold drove the crawler into the lower orchard, Mason stood at the fence and watched it pull a small drag through soil that had not been worked properly in years. The machine moved slowly, but it held its line. Its tracks spread the weight where tires would have sunk. It did exactly what it had been built to do. Mason called across the fence. "How many years do you think it's got?" Harold looked down at the crawler, then back at the field. "Depends who listens," he said. That answer bothered Mason more than any insult would have, because it was not pride, it was a rule. The crawler worked that spring, then the next, then the next. Ellie kept filming, but the videos changed. They were no longer about whether the machine would run. They were about what people miss when they decide too quickly. A rusted hood became the least interesting part of the story. The real story was the man who knew the difference between ugly and finished. By the 7th season, Ruth's buyer had increased the offer to $29,500. Harold folded the letter, put it under the magnet tray, and went back to greasing the rollers. Ellie asked, "Are you ever going to sell it?" Harold looked at the crawler for a long time. Then he said, "When a thing still has work in it, selling it is not always profit. Sometimes it is just giving away tomorrow." That was the line Ellie did not post until years later, because by then the little orchard crawler had pulled drags, hauled limbs, packed lanes, and started every spring after the same patient ritual. Fuel, spark, air, compression. Listen. 19 more seasons. Not because it was magic, because Harold never mistook silence for death. The last time Mason apologized, he did it quietly. He met Harold by the fence after the first frost, watched the old crawler idle under a bare apple tree, and said, "I was wrong about that machine." Harold shook his head. "You were wrong about the question," he said. Mason frowned. Harold rested his hand on the hood. "You asked if it was worth saving. I asked what had stopped it. That is the whole difference. Before you bury anything made by human hands, ask the right question. Does it still turn? Can it still breathe? Is the broken part really broken, or just waiting for someone patient enough to understand it? A machine tells the truth. The trouble is, most people only listen after it starts. Harold listened before, and that is why a $37 funeral became 19 more seasons of work. When Ellie asked what he would do when the crawler finally stopped again, Harold did not hesitate. He looked at the rust, the old tracks, the faded cereal plate, and the orchard beyond it. Then he said, "I'll find the door that locked, and I'll open it again."